energy. So I want to just say a hearty welcome to all the supporters of Affirm, to the leaders from Affirm who are speaking today, to all the chapter representatives from Affirm, and just want to say how really grateful I am as a survivor and as a person who works in survivor leadership and community for your presence. I don't know what we would do without you right now. And I'm so glad that we get to host you so more people get to learn about what you're doing. So thank you. And with no further ado, as noted, I'm going to turn things over to Yasmin Vafa to introduce our speakers today.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you so much for sharing that and for your experiences. I am so thrilled and honored to get to introduce today's panelist of Rights for Girls. Is absolutely more than pleased to be able to sponsor today's event and this conversation. I've had the great privilege of getting to work with and meet many of today's speakers, and I just feel honored that we are able to learn from you today. And so without further ado, today's speakers are Catherine Guerrero Yanez, who is a core member of Affirm Los Angeles and a community organizer working with Indigenous communities, as an educator in Tonga Territory, also known as the San Gabriel Valley, teaching social justice and world religions. Catherine encourages for students to speak up and stand up for injustices that they may witness. As a defender of the land and water, Catherine uses traditional practices of herbalism and medicine making of her ancestors through the guidance of elders and teachers to help serve her community, and has also served as a frontline medic at Standing Rock and in the current uprisings. With the intention of dedicating herself to her students and community, Catherine hopes to bring awareness and sense of empowerment that we all have the capacity to heal ourselves and community, be it through collective care, movement, and with the help of our plant relatives. Kara Jabala Corrales is the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, a statewide government agency in Hawaii restoring equal status for women. Previously, she led the Hawaii Coalition for Immigrant Rights. Kara earned her JD from the University of Hawaii with a specialization in Native Hawaiian law. Kara was recently named one of 20 for the next 20 Hawaii's People to Watch in 2021, and has been featured by US Congress, UN Women, UNDP, UNICEF, and the United States of Women. Her family is from Laguna, Philippines. And last but certainly not least, we are honored to have with us Ninotchka Rosca, who is a multi-awarded novelist and journalist. Born in the Philippines, she brought what she learned from imprisonment during the Marcos martial law regime to the United States and began organizing women within a transnational feminist framework in 1989. This framework was further refined into the cross-ethnic borders philosophy and solidarity in Affirm. She currently works with its transnational committee and has 9 books published in various countries. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kara, who's our moderator for today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Welcome, everybody. Before I put these amazing feminists in the hot seat, I wanted to ground us in shared vocabulary. I'm mestiza, and being mixed race Asian means being asked, was your mom a prostitute and was your father in the military since I was a child. All Filipinas are haunted by the specter of the sex trade. And to say that that stereotype affects our ability to survive is no exaggeration. Many Americans, though, have no sensitivity at all to the way that entire nations of women are typecast as people made by nature to serve the sexual whims of the Western world. So during this conversation, we choose to use the term sex trade and prostitution, not the euphemism sex work. Sex work whitewashes colonization of Turtle Island, the Pacific, Asia, the enslavement of Black and Indigenous people. It basically, to us, also shoves underground the experiences of our survivor communities. The term sex work, in short, is part of the colonial project to erase and replace us. The term sex work was coined by a white American woman who felt unseen as feminists were building power. It's a Western label, and at the end of the day, it fails to destigmatize us and instead destigmatizes exploitation. So I refuse to put that colonizer language on my tongue and force it on my sisters. And so that's that on the language. So let's get to the main show and put these women on stage. So I'm gonna start with Catherine. So my first question to you, Catherine, Rudyard Kipling, who was famously imperialism's poet, if I'm really generous, the Ben Shapiro of imperialism back in the day, invented the phrase, prostitution is the oldest profession. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the sex trade on Turtle Island and your reaction to that idea?
Yeah, the prostitution being the oldest profession, and I'm actually gonna refer to the first time meeting Anochka and hearing from her is that we need to make that correction and say that it's the oldest oppression. It was never a profession. Prior to colonization, prior to Columbus sailing to these shores, the concept of a sex trade did not exist. And again, I'm not going to negate the recognition of the over 565 tribal nations that existed on Turtle Island prior to colonization. So, you know, we cannot speak for all of them, but there is a general consensus that women and children were not commodified or exploited by any means, not used in any way of trade or sale or anything of that sort. And so, you know, I'm Columbus coming to the Teano territories and exploiting those Teano women and children, and having the audacity to write back to his financiers about the new commodity that he found. Young children, 9 and 10-year-olds, because those were the most demanded at the time. You know, but it doesn't end with Columbus. It continued with the romanticized concept of Captain John Smith and John Rolfe and Matoaka, who is Pocahontas, right? We even have the Disney movie made and glorifying that concept. But, you know, we in Indian country identify her as one of the first MMIWs, with one of the first stolen women who was taken and displayed and showed off. And, you know, getting that concept of an exotic woman, right? And continuing with Lewis and Clark, and, you know, having Sacagawea as their guide. Again, these glorifications of these white settler men coming and taking our women and putting them on display and manipulating them and exploiting them and using them. I think about the Buffalo Bill road shows, and again, putting women on display, showing them off, making them an object, and not what they really were. And so I think that's what we also have to take the step back and understand, that when these white settler men came to the shores and started looking at the systems, they saw matrilineal constructs. They saw matriarchs running the show. They saw the women who were connecting to the land and tending the land. And that history goes to our creation. You know, our creation stories are the center of woman. Woman is the either that source of creation, or woman is that connection to creation. And so in order to conquer the land, they had to conquer the women. And so they couldn't understand, because again, they're coming from that Eurocentric, patriarchal understanding, men lead, men control, right? And then they see the reverse of that here. And they had to manipulate that understanding of freedom and autonomy that women had, and manipulate it to say, well, if women have control over their bodies, or if women have control and have sexual relations and such, then that means they're impure. And if they're impure, well, then they're an open resource, right? So we are justified in the continued rape and the commodification of their bodies, that because that's the system. Again, it's kind of like, I'm a history teacher. And so I like to think of these like urban myths that we create about conquest, right? And the justifications that we give, like, so, oh, well, African nations had slaves, so it's okay that we had slaves. We learned it from them. right? Which is a completely false, almost like eugenic made up concept. And so they did that with the women. They said, well, the women here are free and autonomous, so they are impure because, women don't know any better. And so they took that, they manipulated that, and they found a way to control it and essentially profit from it. And then eventually erase it if they wanted to. And so unfortunately, what I'm talking about with Columbus and John Rolfe and Lewis and Clark and Buffalo Bill, it doesn't end there. These aren't historical anecdotes of what the sex trade looked like on, how it was introduced to Turtle Island. It's still here. It's still given those false narratives and those false justifications, especially towards Native women. And just as you mentioned, other women of color living on Turtle Island because of that conquest mentality, right? Of conquering the bodies of these women, exploiting these women, and then profiting off of the bodies of these women, and then utterly making them disposable. And so, it's not a story rather of saying like the history of that sex trade. It's kind of like, how is that continuity still here, right? How have we seen it evolve? And so that's, I always like to think like, our matriarchal system was something that was so powerful, was so beautiful. We were connected to the land, we were connected to our people, we were connected to our communities, and the settlers came and found a way to just rip it away and to control it because that's what they were used to. So.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to turn to Ninotchka now. Catherine's talking about why we need to talk about colonization, not just racism, when we talk about the sex trade. So I'm going to ask you to expand on that. And how does colonization and the land question and the sex trade intersect at the global level, Ninotchka?
Well, it's been one of my frustrations that the discourse in the United States on this issue has been so small, so narrow, and has paid attention only to the European parameters. It's like Holland has legalized prostitution. Germany has legalized prostitution, but there has been a history of legalized prostitution in Asia, and that history has not been good. Far longer than the West's history with organized and legalized prostitution. Now, Catherine has discussed the pattern of imposition of Western perspective on the bodies of women and the power relations between genders. These are replicated all over the world. Since the beginning of history, the dominated and the defeated have comprised the caste of people used in the sex trade. And people talk about, the religious practice. That's very different from the sex trade. The sex trade was rooted in slavery, period. While you had the sex rituals within the temple, the sale of sex was outside the temple in ancient Mesopotamia. We are also familiar with all of the Greek legends about their heroes obtaining this woman or that woman from the battlefield. In many instances during the slave system, the owner would open a brothel house and use those women taken off the battlefield from a defeated tribe and use them to make money as prostitutes. This is the pattern. A colonizer and an occupier setting aside a section of the female population as supply, the supply of goods for the sex trade. And we ask ourselves, why do they keep doing this and doing this and doing this? This is a pattern. They did the same thing in the Philippines. They imposed a binary concept of gender. And suddenly there is a certain category of women reserved for the use of the occupiers. The United States actually organized brothel houses in the Philippines. Well, why do they keep doing this? And I was very happy to have come across a Native American proverb many years ago, which helped me understand why this was being done. And Catherine probably would know this, something like, no nation is defeated until the hearts of its women are on the ground. And then, no matter how good your weapon, it's finished. No matter how well, how strong your brave men, it's done. Because there is a recognition implicit in the way colonialism tyrannizes the female population. There is a logic in it. If the very womb of your nation is debased, is under the control of the colonizer, then everything is destroyed. Then this is connected to land. In certain countries like Bali, Indonesia, there was no individual ownership of land was extant when the Dutch arrived there. Rather, there was a collective arrangement around the water rights, access to water, and who controls, let's say, a spring or a well. These were controlled by women. So to be able to subdivide this kind of collective arrangement around land use, they had to destroy the women's independence, the women's power, and so on and so forth. It's the same thing happened in the Philippines. There was no concept of land title. Yeah, land was communally held. And they discovered this was extremely profitable, the sale of women. In every colonized country in the world, New Zealand, for instance, in 1810, prostitution was more profitable than the sale of wool. Would you believe that? Yeah. In the Middle East, the Crusades were dragging along something like 12,000 prostitutes through the land. Korea, of course, saw 250,000 women taken by its colonizer, Japan, for the use of the military as sex slaves, and so on and so forth. We know in India that there is this concept of really institutionalized use of a specific category of women for the sexual pleasure of men. And I'm talking about the Dalits. Yeah. So this is a pattern that is intimately connected to how the West has colonized and occupied countries and dispossessed huge numbers of people. I think in the Americas, about 100 million people were dispossessed and killed and reduced to certain little corners of the land called reservations. Yes.
Well, Thank you for summing up several thousand years for us. You know, the conversation in the US, as you said, is so narrow and ahistorical. And that's why I think it's so disorienting for so many people. So without this origin story, it's hard to know, you know, just where you stand in terms of the principles and analysis at the outset. So that was really incredible, Ninotchka. Catherine, so Ninotchka just kind of set the stage for this, but can you just briefly explain the difference between Western, or the dominant strand, liberal feminism approaches to systems of prostitution versus Affirm's anti-imperialist abolitionist stance?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in, you know, just kind of taking the moment to process the thousands of years of the exploitation of women, you know, and, you know, just even sitting here, it's like sitting in a classroom again. It's the unpacking, the relearning, and and I'm not saying this in a good way, it just fascinates me how Western and liberal feminism kind of takes the platform of, well, don't we all want the same things, right? Don't we all, like, aren't we all on the same trip here, and wanting to, you know, the equal pay and the equal representation. And it's just like, well, wait a minute. we have thousands of years of trauma to unpack here, right? You know, there's a lot that's gonna need to be assessed and even brought to the table before there is this concept of like a model of feminism, right? So the problem with Western and liberal feminism is that they just categorize us in just one general concept, right? One general ask, one general movement, and not think about the complexities of where, you know, like intersectional women of color are coming from, right? And so one example would definitely be the concept of class. You know, we don't think about, like, you know, there's layers here. So you have the person who owns the brothel, right? That's not the same experience as the person who's working in the brothel. And even if we got this super empowered brothel where it was owned by a woman and she's going to be the woman power, you know, representative of owning brothels, and now she has women working for her in the brothels, that's a completely different experience, you know? The person who is trafficked is a different experience than the person who is going to school and wants a sugar daddy, or who the person who is deciding to do some cam work while, you know, they're doing something else. And so we're not taking into consideration the layers of the experience of women. And so we're just lumping it like, well, we all want to empower women, so let's empower them by, you know, harm reduction and prostitution. Well, wait a minute. The harm has been embedded for thousands of years, 500 plus years, right? You know, specifically speaking on Native women, most of the time Native women are forced into prostitution, and it's not, you know, in that traditional you know, media sense of sex trafficking that we see in, like, you know, motion pictures and such. Like, no, this is through the intergenerational trauma. This is through the systemic racism. This is through the poverty. This is through the continual child sexual abuse that takes place predominantly, like, in Native homes. This is, you know, like, it's all of those things that creates this constant revolving door of making Native women prime targets for a pimp or a trafficker, right? And so that experience is different. That can't be put onto the platform of Western liberal feminism, right? And so when you do that, when you start doing that and saying, well, we're trying to promote empowerment, we're trying to give dignity to this. Well, bottom line, you're erasing or actually negating and making the violence that's being committed against Native women completely invisible. You're no longer bringing that experience to the table. And that's the problem, right? So rather than putting on that suffragette banner and Mary Poppins, like, you know, esque thing that we imagine, it's like, no, sit down and listen. Sit down and listen to our experiences. Sit down and listen to the healing that still needs to happen before we can, like, you know, progress cannot come until there is healing, until there's accountability, until there's an understanding. And there's so many layers to that, you know, we can't even begin to stand under that unified platform, right? And I think that's what's particularly, you know, special and valuable about Affirm is that, one, we don't put the US in the center either, right? We don't put just that United States experience at the center of our conversation, that we're looking in places like the Philippines, we're looking in places like Thailand and, you know, in Guatemala and Haiti, and we're looking at all of these, you know, transnational experiences and trying to understand, well, okay, what is that common core? What is that common thread? And yeah, it's imperialism, it's militarism, it's, you know, these colonial constructs that have conquered the Western world that is continually doing this to women, right? So until we start to address those constructs, we can't create a cute pink hat wearing march and, you know, call it a day. And I'm sorry, like, I mean, it's just, that's not the work here, you know? The work here is healing. The work here is, you know, dismantling those systems and understanding how those systems are hurting our sisters, are hurting our children, are just continuing a systemic evolution of oppression for women, you know, and just new ways and new forms. Just as, you know, I talked about that, it's like, you know, if it's not John Smith, then it's Buffalo Bill. If it's not Buffalo Bill, or, you know, it's, you know, a CEO of a company that's gonna, you know, take profit from women who are doing chem work, whatever. So, you know, and that's what I think, you know, is Affirm's concept, is that, like, we're not promoting that, like, because Western feminism promotes that Eurocentric concept. They want us to lean in, right? Lean in, come and be a part of what we're trying to do here. Break that glass ceiling. I always think of that phrase, and I think, well, what happens to us? Like, we get cut up as we're looking up, as you breaking that ceiling, right? There's no gain for me. And so they want us to be the girl boss. It's this idea of, like, false empowerment, but we're not there yet. We gotta, you haven't even listened to us. You haven't even heard our stories. You haven't even taken accountability for the damage and the exploitation that you have created in our dominant culture, right? The dominant culture has created this, and that's what everybody's moving towards. So you haven't listened to us yet. And so that's Affirm's work. Our work is to make sure that we are listening, and that we are bringing people to the table, and that we are figuring out how can we move forward, and how can we dismantle these larger systems and not the distractions. And so that's the work. That's the tough work, because we have to be in it for the long haul. So, because these, yeah.
So that was a mic drop. Ninotchka, I have two questions for you, but I'm going to start with this. So I've noticed that organizations on both the institutional and populist left kind of, you know, they see this conversation coming up, and they treat the sex trade as something that, you know, why doesn't Affirm just compromise on it? Just, like, let it go and let's just work on other issues. Like, you know, I know that Affirm is a survivor-led and a survivor community of women who've lived through this. But beyond that, why can't Affirm just let it go? And why can't we just live with an expanded and legal sex trade?
Why can't we let it go? That is an interesting question. Does it have to be asked? Catherine, does it have to be asked? Yes. How can something that impacts more than half of the population be a peripheral issue? How can something that is a major factor in the conditioning of the minds of the other half of the population be considered a niche issue? The sex trade in its history has been the foundation of self-entitled privilege of sexual access on the bodies of the young, the vulnerable, the powerless. It fuels a whole spectrum, a whole range of male entitlement, from catcalls, which is some people say is harmless, from catcalls to workplace harassment, and to such concepts as you get laid or laid off for the working class women, to rape, the rape culture, and so on, to femicide. This is our whole range, and at the very root of it is the sex trade. What has happened to our discourse in the United States is we tend to isolate these issues from one another. We may oppose rape culture, but we don't see the sex trade. We may oppose femicide, but we don't see the violence that is inflicted on those who work in the sex trade. And how many, for instance, of the trans women we keep screaming about who have been killed in the course of sex trade transactions. We tend to like compartmentalize. And so we say, this is a women's issue, and therefore it's not really as important as, let us say, class. Yeah. It's not as important as but how do you address imperialism without an understanding of the systems that imperialism built in those countries? Yeah. Then we have this bias in the United States where we implicitly accept the notion under capitalism that a certain class or category of women and poor people can be fodder for a profit-making system. We accept that, and that's why we keep trying to impose this concept of being a prostitute is empowering. Geez, really. There is also this categorization of the sex trade as a women's issue. It's not. It's a men's issue, really. You know, it's men imposing their views on how women's bodies should be treated, should be accessed, and should be handled. That is the paradigm of the sex trade.
Thanks, Ninashka. I'm just gonna piggyback on that and then add this question, because you're talking about these systems really operating as one common project. Is Affirm prudes? you know, the anti-trafficking movement is dominated by the religious and often right-wing folks, you know. So if you could just comment for a second, what's the role of religion in creating this system? Is there one, and how would you explain that?
Are we prudes? Catherine!
That was the setup, but the last part is the most important. Yeah, what's the role of
Yes, but I'm not personally acquainted with the sexual views and attitudes and practices of every member of Affirm. But for myself, I grew up, I was trained in comparative literature. And so I had to have a very serious acquaintance with such books as the Kama Sutra, you know, the unexpurgated version of 101 Nights, the pillow books of Japan, Iran's The Perfume Garden, and other similar classics. It's difficult to be prude after you've read these books, yes, and understand that sexuality is part of society. It is part of social interaction. Now in religion, I think one of the, in terms of Western religion, one of the worst things it imposed on cultures outside Europe is the concept of the binary gender system, which enabled it to declare that this gender and all subsequent genders, marginal genders assigned to that kind of category, all of those can be rendered powerless and therefore commodified. So you have in the sex trade, you know, 90% of those who are bought and sold are women. And there is a very, what you call hefty representation of trans women in the sex trade. Actually, the Philippines was exporting trans women to Japan after the huge scandal erupted over the export of women, of females to Japan. So they started exporting trans women. So it's all of this kind of continuum, yeah. We have seen that there are some really some areas where religion has been particularly repressive of sexuality, and those it has enabled some of very strange practices to arise. I am thinking of the Basho boys in Afghanistan. I still cannot understand it, you know, to this day. And of course, prostituted women were a standard fare in Victorian era. So there is this correlation between the restriction, sexual repression, and prostitution. Yes, we see this in Hawaii, in the history of Hawaii.
Very true. And I want to give a shout out to Victoria Rowland in the chat, who brings up the point of the collusion between the institutions, settler institutions, religious institutions, to law enforcement, to white leadership, colluding to participate in the system and protect it, which, you know, the hypocrisy there does not go unnoticed by us, and it's still extant today. And we work, and Victoria works on the ground here with us in Hawaii. So thank you for bringing up that point, Victoria. I'm going to, I want to get through these questions so bad, but Catherine, would you briefly talk about, you know, is ending the sex trade necessary for decolonization? What does it have to do with decolonization? And how has sexual exploitation been built? You kind of talked about this already, so maybe just that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like when we were prepping and looking at this question, it's kind of like, how is the sex trade kind of built like into like the colonial construct that we've been? It's like, I can think of numerous examples of that, right? Like, you know, and relating it back to the religion question, you know, the mission system here in California, you know, that was another colonial construct that continued to exploit young women and children, and commodification of their bodies and so on, right? Slave labor. Here in California, you could buy a native child for $35. You know, we have ads, and again, this isn't in the history books. This isn't what is, you know, thought of. But so when we start to, you know, preach on this trend of decolonization, right, which essentially has become a trend, it's become a buzzword, and so because of that, I feel like we've lost that. What does that mean? How are we unpacking this concept of decolonization, right? And so I always think of the original, you know, concept with the settlers coming in, and their phrasing was, kill the Indian, save the man, right? And so we have to unpack, well, what is it that they were killing, right? And forget about the woman, right? But it was save the man. But what is it that they were killing, and what they were aiming to annihilate and to rid of was the connection of land and community and space, was the sustainability that we had created for thousands of years, you know. And so they knew. I mean, and that's the thing. This is so intentional. This is so intentional. This is so systemic. It is well thought out. It is a textbook, you know, of how to conquer. And it's, you have to remove all of that and then save that physical being, save that now new mold to accept capitalism, to accept the colonial construct, to accept even the patriarchy, which is now in Indian country a huge problem that women in Indian country are having to navigate within their own tribal affairs, right? And so it was to build that up. And so now when we start talking about, okay, well, let's start decolonizing, what does that mean? Okay, well, let's go back to our ancestral foods, right? Okay, good, let's do that. Oh, let's get rid of a standard work day. Okay, yes, let's get rid of that, right? And so what happens is that we've adopted so much of that dominant culture again, right? That dominant culture being capitalism, being, you know, the 9 to 5, being the get up and get going, pull yourself up, you know, something from nothing, whatever, right? It's been so ingrained and so embedded that there's certain identifiers that are becoming difficult to part with, right? So those who are calling for the anti-capitalism, those who are calling for, you know, the, you know, ending of, you know, a 40-hour work week, all of those things. But why is it that we want to keep the billion-dollar industry that the sex trade has created, right? Why are we fighting for that part, right? Why are we fighting for that buyer and seller exchange that looks a lot like capitalism? Why are we fighting for the continuous buying of human bodies, right? And then why are we putting it in a nice little package of a bow saying, well, it's empowering, right? And so that is the, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm going to end this with, you know, answering this question with a question that it's like, why? You know, why are we on this decolonization trip if we want to hold on to really the root of our trauma, the root of our exploitation? You took our life givers, you took our women, you took our children. So you took our life givers, our future, our tenders to the land, and you commodified them and made them into something that you wanted. And that's the one thing that we're gonna leave as an exemption to the rule and say decolonize everything else but this. I don't understand that, because that is the root of our trauma. That is the root of just that cyclical intergenerational violence and trauma that continues. And maybe it's so embedded in our DNA that unfortunately it has become part of our identity. And that's the sad part. I don't want to think they won. I don't want to think that they took so much from us that we now identify and make this an empowering notion, when it is based on the pure hatred and racism of Native women, and not just Native women of Turtle Island, but the Native women in the Philippines, the Teano women, the women in just all over this world. That's what they took from us. That is the root. And so when you want to decolonize, my understanding of healing from my elders, we go to the root. And so I don't understand why that's on the table. So that's.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to just, I don't know if everybody's watching the chat too, but I also want to uplift Tanya Smith Johnson, who brought up, you know, the important point that the enslavement and commodification of Black women is completely, divorced from this conversation. And that's another question that we need to be pushing to be at the forefront. You know, why is that just conveniently left out or severed? Like that was a separate history, as if that was a separate history, and as if it just stopped suddenly. When all of this is really a continuation, as you're sharing of these processes of colonization. Back to Ninashka, we only have, I think, about 5 more minutes. So if you both could keep, I'm trying to power through them. Ninashka, Affirm is an acronym, and the R in Affirm stands for Re-feudalization. And I've noticed it's now kind of catching on. There's an American political theorist named Jody Dean, who wrote an article in the LA Book Review about neo-feudalism. Can you explain Re-feudalization? Can you expand on this in the relationship to the sex trade and women of color?
Very briefly, re-feudalization is the re-emergence of certain feudal roles and processes, which are supposedly industrialized to make capitalism and profit-making even more efficient. Yeah, actually, this I saw this concept in first time in Iraq, when the war machinery subcontracted all kinds of parts of its viciousness, to workers from overseas. And then you had the intervening middleman, the guild master, as it were, who funneled the poor labor, the workers, to this, that place, yeah. And so I was looking at this and looking at the same time at the push to legalize, institutionalize domestic work. Again, the justification given was for the good of the women. We hear that all the time. And so I was worried, but I supported this because our women who are being exported all over the world were certainly in very dire straits, in slave-like conditions. And we were sold the idea that by recognizing this as work, those slave-like conditions can be changed, not oh. So I started thinking about this and came up with the concept of re-feudalization, which occasioned a lot of sniggering among the left and populist woke movements of the time when we lost Affirm. I think Mikey, was it Mikey, who was at one time told me that there were some male progressives sidling up to her and saying, could you please explain what is re-feudalization? Yeah. So now we have this concept from Jody Dean and nobody is laughing. Huh?
That's true. when a white woman says it, right? Yeah. Well, thank you for, making sure we know what it's about and where it started and what we mean by that and why it's a process that we identified early on as something that we need to fight against. So Catherine, we acknowledge that for some people, the sex trade and prostituting is empowering. That's an individual experience. And that's true. But is it inherently violent? And does naming the sex trade as a violent institution mean we're suggesting that everyone has similar experiences?
I think, and I think, recognizing, bringing in, yes, we absolutely need to have Black women in that narrative as well, and also to Native women, and knowing that the sex trade was created out of violence. It was created out of violence. That is where it came from, and so we have to acknowledge that. And that was for both women, right? When you are viewed again by the dominant society, by the settler colonial construct that you are property, right? As Black slaves were viewed as property, or as you were viewed as a savage in a Native sense, then you're not human, right? You don't exist. And so therefore, whatever should happen to you doesn't matter, right? And so I think we have to acknowledge that the trade is rooted in violence. Now, is that the shared experience among every prostitute or person who is in the trade? I have not done the qualitative research, and but the studies that I have reviewed and researched, and I want to say that I want to also take the time to note that when it comes to researching prostitution and sex trafficking in Native communities, there's probably maybe only about 3 to 4 real case studies done, qualitative research done, and so that in itself is an erasure of experience, right? But I think one of the things that stands out to me the most in what I have read is just a very simple quote, but it's haunting. And it's that a woman got into a car of a buyer, and a Native woman, and he looked at her and he said, "I thought we killed you all." That's violence, right? She may not have had a violent experience with that client. She may not have, whatever type of experience she had, but that mindset, that's the violence. That's where it's rooted. That's where the buying and the selling of human bodies is rooted in violence. And so, we see this happening, over and over. And yes, we unfortunately right now, the narrative and the trend is that it is empowering, that it is dignified, that it is something to be proud of, right? But are we really listening to all of our survivors? Are we really listening to their stories? And that's kind of like the clap back that we get, right? Listen to X, Y, and Z, listen to, and then when we do, and we read through these heartbreaking, horrific stories, finding out the actual statistics of how many women are homeless, how many women are doing this for survival, how many people are doing this because they're forced and there's violence being threatened against them or family members, or how many are doing this because they have no family and they've lost that and they're escaping, right? And then we say, yes, this is rooted in violence, then we're going back to our previous question, we're the prudes. We're the, we're the swerfs, we're the, we're those things. But again, we're listening. We're bringing folks to the table, and we're listening to their experience, and we're asking, well, what do you need, right? Do you need resources? Do you need exit strategies, right? And Native women, they're finding out that there are women as old as 50 and 60 years old still in prostitution because they can't leave. There's nothing for them, right? Our extraction industries are creating, systems for them that they go and do private parties and they do all of these performances and such, right? Because there's nothing else for them. And so that's what we're doing. So it's like, can I put just like the concept of feminism, can I put an umbrella, can I put a blanket over every experience and say that it is inherently not violent or it is inherently violent? I can't, but I can tell you that the root of it is in violence. I can tell you that the mentality of a buyer choosing to buy a person is rooted in violence, is rooted in that construct of violence, absolutely. And that is because Black, Indigenous women in Turtle Island have been seen as either not human or property. And you have that say so to have whatever you want with them. That's violence.
Yeah, I mean, it's a system that sells objectification, and that in and of itself will guarantee violence. I think Beth you and Beth in the chat raised a really good point, paralleling this also to militarism. We have so many cousins, brothers, dads, men in our community that were dependent on militarism to make it out, and have their identities bound up in that institution. And for some of them, it was empowering. For some of them, through the course of their life, it became less so, through awareness or injury or whatnot. But it still doesn't mean that the institution itself wasn't violent. So thank you so much for breaking that down. Okay, so I'm gonna do one question each before I kind of start segging, but if you could try to keep it to maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Ninashka, what would be the impact of illegal sex trade on immigrant communities? And can we see, what else has happened in the world?
Well, that's very easy to see. We just have to look at Germany, where prostitution is legal. There is a whole caste of women, somewhat like the Dalits, who are considered fodder for the sex trade. And these are the poor women of Romania. And then you look at Italy and you see women from Nigeria trafficked into the country. So Spain has the Filipinas, and Filipinas are also being trafficked into Syria. It really doesn't matter which side of the superpower divide one is. When it comes to this issue of the sex trade, both do it. Yeah. So this is what I fear about legalization, the creation of a caste of Black, brown, young, powerless, to service, what they call it service, but really to be bought and sold in the sex trade. It's already happening. We know that 70% of the women in the sex trade are Black. Around 90, between 80 to 90 of those trafficked into the sex trade are women, children of color. Yes, there's already a caste system, even within the sex trade itself. Yes.
Thank you. Catherine, final question for you right now, if you could 1 to 2 minutes. What's the intersection between the MMIWG crisis and the sex trade? Because I see a lot of people just say, well, it just has to do with a pipeline and not go any deeper than that. So If no pipeline, no problem. Can you go deeper?
Yes, and this is gonna be difficult for like 1 to 2 minutes, but so I mean, bottom line, our extractive industries, I mean, it's just a catchphrase if you want to think about it visually, our extractive industries, coal, mining, water, oil, all of that extracts women from their roles, right? So that's kind of the simple way to think of it. We're not only extracting from our mother, but we are extracting women from what they should be. And we do this because what happens is in these extractive industries, the pipelines, the mining, all of that, they create these man camps, right, in which men go, and they leads to a spike of the commercial sex industry, right? So we need to entertain our workers, and this is what, mind you, they guise as this is progress, this is job creation. So anytime they're talking along those lines, these are the exact camps that they are talking about. And these camps will literally snatch up women from the local reservations because of jurisdiction issues. Again, this is the Wild West. It is a no man's land. They know that if they are to take a woman from her reservation and commit a crime against her outside of her reservation cannot convict them because it's outside of the reservation lines, or vice versa. If they commit a crime on the reservation, then they cannot be convicted within the reservation territory because they are not a citizen of the reservation. And oftentimes those men are not citizens of the states or cities or counties in which they are working in, right? So, and this is not just seen in oil pipelines, this is seen around Navajo Nation with all of the uranium mining, the fracking that's going on there. This is seen in the border towns of Sonora, where my people are from, and the building of a wall that was going on, you know. So any type of extractive industry that is framed in the sense of progress and job creation is essentially putting men into these territories where it's a no man's land, it's free range. And these women are susceptible, and it's even documented that in places like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, and New Mexico, their social services and even their criminal, like, you know, justice services cannot handle the influx of assault cases that start coming their way. And so that's very much how it's connected, because it starts with the idea of stripping for these men or doing a date with these men, but then these women go missing. And then that's the overlap, you know, and so that's the gist in the 1 to 2 minutes. There's obviously a lot more that can go in depth, but you know, essentially that's what's happening. We're extracting from our earth, but we're also extracting women at the same time. And unfortunately, the profits of those extraction industries ring louder than the lives of these women.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind how even the non-native allies against projects like DAPL and proponents of the Green New Deal, for example, have no problem saying oil jobs are dangerous, we must and can do better. But then when we say, you know, the sex trade is ferociously violent and dangerous, we can and must do better, it's crickets. Mm-hmm. Or violent opposition to us. So I just wanted to also point that out. And then what you were saying about, you know, the problem is the demand of men. So really it's men concentrating in certain areas, transient men in particular, who have no ties to the area. There's not an accountability culture or process that touches them. And in Hawaii, we see something really similar because we are edging towards 10 million tourists per year. And also, you know, we are the most militarized state in the United States, where, you know, a third of the land on the island where I am is under federal control. And most of that is being used for military. And so, you know, you will see all the discounts and all the discounts to military personnel. And we've had research on just the astronomical demand in Hawaii that cannot be met by the current supply. So I want to just pivot before we go into Q&A and wrap up. We're about 10 minutes behind, but I hope folks will be lenient with us if anyone wants to hang out. So I just want to clarify Affirm's policy, because it's like, okay, like that was so much history, so much data. Where are we now, and what is Affirm proposing? Because a lot of the time, because people are so threatened by this stance, because it challenges white supremacy, you know, they try to smear the organization. So let's start where we agree on. You know, we all agree that the status quo is unbearable. So the status quo is often called, the policy status quo is often misnamed as a prohibition. But we know that there has never been an authentic attempt to actually address demand, and that prohibition is basically just this sexist, Victorian-driven vice squad policy of trying to stop the women and blame the women for, and gender expansive people for the sex trade. And very little, I mean, it's laughable. It's more, I'm not advocating for a roundup or carcerality, but you are more likely to get get busted for jaywalking than exploiting a vulnerable person in Hawaii. So there's no prohibition. But that said, the criminalization of people in the sex trade escalates the harms perpetuated by traffickers, pimps, and buyers. So that's our starting point. And our also starting point just with other feminists is that we should be all able to agree that the objectification of Black, Native, and women of color is harmful. We don't want that. So we want to all expand and grow compassion and shift the paradigm for people in the sex trade and reduce harm to them. But that's kind of where it ends, right? Like, how do we do that? And the narrative goes that unionization, like state management of this industry, but keeping the hand of the state, keeping that off and letting the invisible hand of the market, do its thing. And some light labor rights will solve the incredible violence of this institution. And our stance is grounded in reality, that's utopian and unworkable. Just listening to women in Aotearoa, listening to women in the Pacific and Asia who've been through these regimes. I mean, in Hawaii, this already happened. There was de facto decrim. There was legalization where the military, the Department of Defense, and Honolulu Police Department officially ran the sex trade. So all of this has been tried before. And if we know for a fact that the only thing that happens is that it expands. And in order to fill the expanded demand, you have to find a cheap, easy supply because there's not enough voluntary people. And so where do you get that? The most marginalized people, the most broken, by colonization, intentionally broken, constantly under attack by the state, and structural racism and structural sexism. And that is really Native Hawaiians and Black women and girls and children and immigrants. And so for us, what we advocate at Affirm and what, for example, our Hawaii chapter has called is bodies back, not just land, but also bodies back. First and foremost, we want immediate decriminalization of people prostituting, period. And we have a success story. We became the first state in the United States last year, and we continue to be the only state that allows people to vacate a prostitution conviction and expund their record in order to facilitate exit from carceral patriarchy. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we advocate for is prioritizing non-state alternatives and community-based solutions that are directed by our community and survivors, the at-risk population. For example, we had a femicide-free zone that was established in one of our neighborhoods during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic last year to try to create a culturally restorative response where really the local community is deciding how to intervene. But we also want accountability for men who depend on the exploitation of marginalized people to get sexual gratification. That's the right framing, right? It's not that in itself, like Catherine was describing, we view as unjust. It is, we can say that's immoral. It is immoral to exploit somebody. It's immoral, like why do you want to get sex from somebody who you know is so poor that they can't say no, that they're having sex because they have to, not because they really want to. So in fact, it is a politics of joy and sexual liberation that we're advocating, where we co-create the sexual experience and it's not an act of servility. And lastly, I would say for Affirm, you know, there's a lot of things that we do in terms of creating the material conditions that women need to alleviate vulnerability. But we also want to model non-Western justice systems and deprofessionalize all of this, mediation, reconciliation, restorative justice, and engage grassroots communities to define what a truly safe place for women and gender expansive people would look like. So that's us in a gist in terms of our concrete policy. And the last thing I will say is, it's so odd that people might criticize us or other feminists for not, like, well, they don't, you know, it's just about vulnerability. And, you know, if it was just about vulnerability, then why aren't women trading like sewing or art or other things? Why is that not valuable? Why is it our bodies? So we know that it's not rooted in just the vulnerability, but we also do comprehensive work to facilitate a new economy. So in Hawaii, you might know us for being the first government to co-create with community activists a feminist economic recovery from COVID-19, which lays the groundwork for a transition away from this horrific system known as capitalism, which is one with white supremacy and systemic sexism and patriarchy. So just want to give a shout out to those who were here who co-created that with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Q&A now for a couple questions before I ask one final one to Ninachka and Catherine. So if you would just throw up questions, let's see, in the chat, we can start there. Okay, we have one already. Can you talk about the organizing against the sex trade? How do we beat a multi-billion-dollar industry that has seeped itself, seeped itself into our schools, into academia, our media, social media, hell, even in our own movements as something empowering? How do we build broad coalitions, wage campaigns, and win concrete victories? Catherine, did you want to jump in? Okay.
Yeah, I could jump in. I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that organizing isn't as luxurious or as trendy as Instagram and other social medias make it out to seem. You know, it's work. It's a lot of work, and it's about building relationships. And I'm going to kind of speak a little bit more from like a Native perspective, that it's about building relations, and it's about taking a seat at the table and breaking bread. And I know that, you know, COVID kind of put a halt to a lot of communication, community building and such, but I mean, that's what it takes. It takes building those bridges, having conversations beyond a screen, having conversations beyond words and text, and actually finding those commonalities and finding like, how can we support one another and build each other? And that's how you start building coalitions. So just as you talked about earlier with the comment about like, you know, white allies in, you know, extractive industry like that are coming and helping and, you know, setting up camps or donating food and what have you. But it's like, okay, well, let's have the conversation, right? Like when that mic is passed to you as a white person, where are you going to offer the mic to someone else's experience, right? To elevate that experience. Because we already have that narrative. And so I think as an educator, like the one thing that comes to my mind constantly is the unlearning. And I say that as an educator, and I say that knowing what textbooks look like and what that narrative looks like. And so there's a lot of unlearning. And so I think also with the organizing community building is accessible education, right? Workshops, conversations like this right now, offering those, making them accessible to individuals, holding space for people to unpack what they've heard and what they've learned, and then following through with next steps. But it's really about community, right? Because once this is gone, once our goals are achieved and we are liberated and we're not under the confines of capitalism, well, guess what we're going to have to do? We're going to have to build community, right? So let's already be there. Let's already be in that connection with one another to do that. And so, I'm old school. I believe in the power of the people and sitting with our elders and listening and sharing and then moving forward, but yeah, power of communication, words, exchange, breaking bread.
Yunashka, I have a question for you that I got DM'd, I think. Should we wait for capitalism to be over? Do we have to wait for capitalism to be over for the sex trade to be over? Because people always say that.
Capitalism will not be over as long as it can transfer what should be social responsibilities to private individuals. It will never be over unless we destroy one by one all the foundational practices of capitalism. Is the raising of children as individual concern, etc., etc. I mean, you're talking about equal pay, equal work. What kind of madness is this? This is the particular left-wing madness that for women to liberate themselves, women have to engage in production. Marx, we have been engaged in production since the beginning of time. This is the truth. That engagement has not been recognized, has not been given due value. And furthermore, that engagement has been narrowed, kept very narrow. So you lack the infrastructure to even engage in production. What are you gonna do with the kids? Who's gonna take care of the kids? Who's gonna provide psychological support to the men, etc., etc.? If that's the kind of thinking that that's gonna prevail, we will never see the end of capitalism. Ridiculous.
I will point people to Beth's comment in the chat, which was also fantastic. Thank you. All right, let me just scroll for a second. Bear with me. So there's a question about how we can be supportive of those who identify as sex workers. Which folks in our community, some do, and Affirm. I want to give an example. So Affirm Hawaii is running the only emergency crisis COVID fund during COVID-19 for those in prostitution in Hawaii. So we are very involved in walking the talk and being there to support those who might not be ready or able to leave, or might not have that orientation yet for whatever reason. And so our politics don't just stop at those who are already there with us, because exit takes perhaps even a lifetime. All right. And so for us, what's been really important, and I know some folks here on the call in Hawaii, we are trying to create and support more survivor spaces where that type of problem solving can come directly from survivors who are at a place where they feel supported enough to do that publicly. And it's not easy work. So each chapter in Affirm has their own projects similar, but that's just my answer from Hawaii. All right, I'm gonna turn back to Catherine and Ninochka with one question. Where and how does Affirm need support? How can attendees here contribute? Ninochka or Catherine?
Well, we do have campaigns right now in New York, for instance. I'm in New York, so we just got good news that Manhattan is gonna adopt the equality model. Yes, but there's also a very strong push in Queens, Queensboro, which we call Immigrantsville. So we're launching a campaign in Queens to open a space for the ordinary people to speak out, to say something about this issue, because it has been so dominated by all of these people who are ideologized, whether on this side or that side. We need to have the ordinary people in whose residential area these brothel houses will be, to say something, to come up and say something. So we have that campaign. How do we help those who are in the sex trade? We do not take that kind of attitude in New York that we need to help them. What we think of is we have to provide the infrastructure to enhance their ability to help themselves. So our emphasis has always been on pushing for exit programs. We don't have enough exit programs, and the ability of those who do not work for the pimp lobby to speak out and talk about their experience. We need so much help, I tell you, because it's $1 billion industry. Man, we're fighting. Somebody was, I was being interviewed by the media, and he said, couldn't you just choose an easier issue? No.
Yeah, well, I would direct folks then to look up a chapter wherever they are and get in touch with Affirm on social media. I think that's one of the easiest ways. And unfortunately, I have to stop Q&A now, but we have one final question for Catherine and Ninochka, because it is really about, Affirm to me is about hope and hopeful politics. And so I want to just close with our positive vision. So liberal feminism says, Ninochka alluded to this, that we will have reached our goal once women get equal pay, equal representation, can sell their bodies if they want, and have abortion access. That's kind of white feminism right now, right? With allies. And those measures are, those are basically the measures of women's liberation in the United States. There are supposed North Star, as progressives say. What are the specific and concrete alternative goals that you would propose or Affirm would propose? How do you, Affirm, anti-imperialist feminists, measure women's liberation?
I can start. It's interesting though. I don't know how concrete exactly mine is, but again, I tend to think of, this idea of like a return to self, right? And we hear that, like, in other mantras of like decolonization and the land back movement, bodies back, right? And it's like, well, what does that mean? You know, because a lot of people also don't understand those concepts. They tend to think like land back, like, oh, okay, we're just going to give the land back to the Native Americans. Is that right? Like we just hand it back over and then they're going to be happy. And it's not that, because I feel that we have a seed in us. Our ancestors have left seeds in us, a memory of sorts of how we were, of how the ways that we lived. And those are the cries that we hear today. Those are the fights that we continue, right? It is coming from those seeds. And so, but because again, we exist in a capitalistic society, because we live in concrete, you know, I'm technically an urban Indian, you know, because I'm not on a res. And we feel lost and we feel disconnected. And again, that leads to the hopelessness and that leads to all of those things. And so the liberation, in my vision, is returning back to ourselves, returning back to our ancestral ways and being able to eat our ancestral foods and being able to tend to the land, you know, giving the stewardship, not the physicality of the land, but the stewardship, or even just, I mean, some folks are saying, just give us the say. Just invite us back to just hear what we have to say about how we should move forward and progress. And so the way that I see it is that, you know, again, the colonizers came with very, 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 very visual intentions of wiping this way out to make way for what we see today, right? And I don't want that to win. I don't want that continual violence over women. I don't want that continual oppression over, you know, Black, Indigenous women of color and children and two-spirited individuals. I don't want that to win. And so I think that when we return back to ourselves, when we go back to that healing, when we go back to those ways, and some of us may be lost because our languages are lost, because our ancestors don't know their languages, or our grandparents don't know their languages, or any of those things. But that revival and that effort towards that revival needs to be done in order to heal. And then we have liberation.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Ninotchka?
Well, as somebody of great age, I have seen the rise and fall of all kinds of paradigms, you know, proposed paradigms supposedly meant to solve all the ills of the world. Yeah. Up and down, the rise and fall, etc. But we still keep going back to the old, you know, proposals, the old thesis. I think there are two things we must keep in mind. One, feminism is still a developing ideology. It does not have its Bible. You know, it's still writing its Bible. That's number one. Sorry to use such a cultural laden word. And that's the first. The second is that a lot of the paradigms that we are being offered as a post-capitalist solution is still based on class societies, on how class societies can develop from this stage towards something a little bit more amiable. I'm a very radical person. And so my thinking is we should go back to that fork in the historical road where we made the wrong choice. We have to examine that and study that and develop a paradigm out of that. Yes. And I'm talking about that fork in the road where we decided that women can be property because that fork was the one that created the entire class system that we have had to deal with. We had to study that.
Well,
yes.
Let us transcribe some of this. It's the Foundation Subset Bible. Thank you so much too for taking some of those tough questions. Thank you also to Repair and Rights for Girls. This is winnable, folks. I want to say that. I believe that. So I want to thank your bravery and for all of the women on here, not just the panelists and organizers, but for living in the line of fire every day. To our survivor sisters in the organization, on the front lines, we salute you. And I'm turning it back over to Beth. Thank you, everybody.
So I don't really have words to express how truly, deeply grateful I am for this conversation. There are not a lot of spaces I get to be in as an organizer or a survivor, a feminist, where I just keep getting to go, not just yay, and I agree, but oh, thank you so much for saying that. You just put into words something I was feeling so deeply or needed to hear so much. And it's really an amazing experience to just have that happen and keep moving back and forth between all these beautiful, beautiful voices, you know, for more than an hour. So this was very precious. And I want to just really honor the energy and commitment and time that Catherine and Anachka and Kara all put into the conversation, and also to thank Rights for Girls for co-sponsorship. I want to ask a couple things of our audience and those who see the recording later. Everyone who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording. I want to invite all of you to get it onto your social media, send it to people you know. There's a lot of, you know, just unfunded and sometimes emotionally costly work that goes into generating so much clarity, and we want to make sure it has the greatest possible impact. So that's my ask of our audience is share the recording, share it and share it and share it. Tell people why it mattered to you, say something about it. Let's really get it out there. I also want to invite the audience to stay with the series. So I've put the link into the chat for the last event in this series, which took place as a survivor-driven conversation, an all-survivor conversation entitled Shouting into the Storm, the Erasure and Marginalization of Survivors of Sexual Exploitation. And that featured some incredible folks, Christine Stark and Christine Eduardo and Melanie Thompson. So I hope folks will go listen, and if you're catching this recording later, you will find that video archived on our YouTube channel along with this one, so you'll be able to look at what else we have to offer in order to find it. This series continues. This is just the first two events. We are very deeply committed to building alternative languages and facilitating more mobilization of people who are committed to ending sexual exploitation. So we'll be continuing conversations about Indigenous resistance, about the role of the military, about the role of white nationalism in facilitating the sex trade, building conversations between prison abolitionists and sex trade abolitionists, getting more attention to immigrant survivor testimony and experiences, having a conversation about LGBTQ experiences in sexually exploitative settings and dynamics, and anything else that we think we need to do. As a disability justice organization, we will also definitely create spaces for survivors to tell the stories about our lived and embodied experiences of sexual exploitation, how they continue to manifest in our psyches and impact our health. So stay with us. For those attending, I will put the link to our events registration page in the chat. And for those watching on video, you'll see a link to see what's upcoming at any given time. And we'll continue to post events as we go. Again, I want to thank everyone. I want to encourage those who can to donate to Affirm. And I want to close by saying that one of the things that makes our work much, much harder is that so many survivors are devastated enough that, or struggling to survive enough that our voices are outside of the conversation. We absolutely need allies who are listening hard to us to do some of the work, but we find very, very few. So there are almost no organizations anywhere that I would say this about, but I'd like to say as a survivor, one of the things I think you must do to support us is to support Affirm. They do the very difficult work of speaking both with and from the experiences of the survivors who are in the organization, and speaking with a deep and ethical commitment to carry the needs and narratives of survivors into policymaking, into advocacy, So this is the organization I back. And when you see people criticizing Affirm or attacking it for supposedly hurting people in the sex industries, please feel free to write to me, because I'm one of the people who will answer publicly and say, no, that's not true. Affirm is here for us. So I'm going to turn things over now to Yasmin and ask her to share any last events or information from Rights for Girls, and then any last notes from Cara.
Sure. Well, I just want to echo everyone's thanks. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the participants. This is such an enriching and powerful conversation, and one that I think is absolutely critical to this movement, right? And I think, we're very eager to share the video. We'll have all of those available to participants. I just wanted to highlight some upcoming events that participants may want to look out for that are related to some of the issues discussed today. Next week, Rights for Girls will be joining a press conference with bipartisan leaders in Congress to introduce probably the most sweeping children's rights criminal justice package at the federal level. This is a bipartisan package, something that many advocates, including formerly incarcerated youth, many of whom are survivors of trafficking and sexual exploitation, who have been wrongly and unjustly criminalized, have been supporting for quite some time. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be April 28th. And you can follow us on social media to hear more about those events. There will also be a briefing, a congressional briefing on the intersections between foster care, juvenile justice involvement for sexual exploitation survivors, particularly young LGBTQ youth of color. And so I just wanted to highlight those events. There's going to be lots of events that I think Rights for Girls, Repair, and Affirm will be sponsoring. Please follow us all on social media where you'll get the most up-to-date info and links on all of those events. But I just want to echo everyone's thanks for this enriching and important conversation. And thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with all of us.
And Cara, if there's anything you'd like to add now, you're welcome to. And if not, we'll close for today. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.